Today, I'd like to continue a dialogue with Archbishop Gomez from a recent address he gave about reflections on the church in America and new religions in our society. Uh, Another point that the Archbishop makes is that the space that the church is permitted to occupy is shrinking. Christians are being harassed because they are a threat to the freedoms of others in society. So, in the Archbishop's telling of it, we used to occupy kind of a wider space in society, and now our space is shrinking. Uh, and again, we would ask for some specifics here. Well, what specific spaces are shrinking in terms of the church and society? Certainly, our space is really basically a religious space. It's a space of worship. It's a space of education. It's a space of charity, works of charity, the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. How would those be shrinking? How is the government forcing those to shrink? That would be again a great subject for dialogue, but there's a certain vagueness in how the Archbishop presents it. He also talks about the dramatic social changes that have happened as a result of the pandemic. And certainly there have been many social changes, but basically those changes are of a health care nature, are they not? There are certain restrictions that are in place, wearing masks, getting vaccinations, keeping social distance, certain closures that we had to have not to spread the virus. So there are changes. There were dramatic changes in our way of life, things that we weren't used to experiencing. But certainly there were necessary changes to curtail the spread of a virus. So dramatic in a certain sense, but really pretty logical and common sense measures when you look at it. So to say that they are dramatic social changes, they certainly were restrictions, but the things that were pretty much things that one would anticipate for ways of curbing a virus so that it wouldn't spread like wildfire. And those social changes, of course, are temporary measures that are put in place to protect people. And we will see, of course, how that evolves in the future when the virus is more restricted. Can we lift some of those requirements and take perhaps different approaches there? The Archbishop also talks about our universities and cultural institutions that were advocating for these, what he calls new social movements. So there are new social movements that, again, the Archbishop does not identify, but he does say that many of our universities and cultural institutions were advocating for these changes. Again, difficult to dialogue because we don't know which universities, we don't know which cultural institutions, and we don't know what social movements. So difficult to really speak to those. It's kind of out there, but not really specific. And the Archbishop makes the point in his address that these movements were unleashed by the pandemic and the killing of George Floyd. So there were movements that were out there, and they were accelerated by the pandemic and by the killing of George Floyd. Well, again, we don't know which movements the Archbishop is referring to in terms of the unleashing, but the pandemic really, what it unleashed were restrictions in terms of social movement, mask wearing, vaccinations, certain closures that had to happen to restrict it. Is that a movement? Is it something temporary? Is it something sinister or something necessary? Again, we'd have to kind of dialogue about that. And there are, levels of discussion. Some people might say, well, you shouldn't wear a mask, you shouldn't get vaccinations. You don't need to do that. Just let the virus spread and see what happens. There are different discussions that people will have, and some people, reject certain science and reject vaccination. So there are discussions, there are dialogues, but again, this doesn't seem to be too specific in terms of what the Archbishop is saying in his address. Um, then about the killing of George Floyd, what was unleashed? Well, certainly what was unleashed was outrage, protests against it, called for reform, that a police person who is so well trained and wasn't a neophyte, was a trainer and could do something like that to someone who was passing a counterfeit bill. It seemed totally inappropriate for people. And so people questioned, well, maybe we should change some of our police practices. Maybe, for example, people who are more skilled with mental health issues should be involved. If, people are acting in certain ways, maybe other things are appropriate rather than those extreme measures, and of course, even death of a person who at that point, was innocent of any crime, was sort of executed on the street. Is that appropriate? So there were certain criticisms that were raised of police practices, and there was a general abhorrence of what had happened in society. But to say they were unleashed by that, certainly there was a buildup of other incidents, many incidents over several years that led to some of those protests. The Archbishop then makes a statement about racial and economic inequality, and he says they are still deeply embedded in our society. So he talks about the racial inequality, the economic inequality. He says that they are deeply embedded in our society. So again, this would cause us to reflect further and say, well, if they are deeply embedded in our society, well, how did they get to be deeply embedded in our society? What can we do to remove them from our society so that our society promotes more racial equality and more opportunities for people, more economic opportunities? Certainly, that would be a very important dialogue to have, discussion to have. And the Archbishop seems to be advocating for that, as he says that they are deeply entrenched. So this is not a superficial problem, it is a deep problem. Of course, deep problems involve a deep dig on our part to understand, well, what are the causes of this? How can this be addressed? So certainly an important point there. Then he says that new social justice movements are what he calls pseudo religions. So these new religions that he's saying come from new social justice movements. And again, what would be those new social justice movements? Unfortunately, they're not named by the Archbishop, so we can't really understand to what specifically he is referring. Some people have taken it to be referring to the Black Lives Matter movement, but certainly that isn't new. It goes back before, several years before the killing of George Floyd. So that might not be the movement he's referring to. So it's difficult to understand exactly what he is referring to. And then how are they pseudo religions? Well, a pseudo religion is something that is false. Obviously, it's a false religion. And the purpose of religion is to bind, religio coming from Latin religiare, to mean to bind, so to bind us to God, to increase our relationship with God, to increase our love for God, and to make us more aware of God's love for us. Certainly that would be the purpose of religion. But how those particular movements become religions, the Archbishop is going to go into it a little bit more in depth, and we can discuss it a little bit more there. But it would seem to say that they are religions. That might be an extreme statement. How are they religions? We'd have to go into a little bit more, and the Archbishop does do it, so we'll take a look at that, as I said. Um, And he said, well, what are these movements called? So he names them, and he says they can be called social justice, they can be called wokeness, they can be called identity politics, they can be called intersectionality, and they can be called successor ideology. And they claim, he says, to offer what religion provides. So let's take a look at some of those specific concepts one at a time there. So the first one he says is social justice. Well, social justice, it's kind of unfortunate that the Archbishop would name that, since social justice is a constitutive component of Catholic moral theology, and has been, of course, for some time. And to say that social justice is a something that is a pseudo religion or tries to offer what religion provides, it's really a one component of religion, one aspect of religion, and that is our moral response. And justice, of course, is an important moral virtue that we try to cultivate within ourselves. And of course, the social aspect is that justice for in society. So a specific movement, though, called social justice. Again, I'm just unaware of any specific movement where people would say, social justice. It seems to be more of a component of our moral theology, and kind of unfortunate that the Archbishop would call it out. But we'll pursue some more of those terms and movements that the bishop calls out in our third part.